So we're all privileged to have Professor Ortiz with us tonight to talk about the experiences of Latino Americans and particularly Latino workers. And Paul's going to talk for a bit, maybe 20, 30 minutes about, and then we're going to have some questions. Some of them have already been prepared, and we're co-sponsoring this with the Cornell Latino Alumni Association, and they've got some too. I'll turn it over to Christina from the CLAA to say a few things, and then Professor Ortiz can start.
Hello, everyone. As Richard said, CLAA, the Cornell Latino Alumni Association, is co-sponsoring this event, and we are really excited to be able to be here and to represent and to ask Professor Ortiz some really important questions that I think are impacting the community today, and just to get his fresh perspectives on what challenges may exist and how we can support the community moving forward. So with that said, just a real quick plug for CLAA. If anyone is interested in kind of participating in our alumni association, please feel free to reach out. That is why we're here. And we're really focused and interested really in creating a community of alumni where we can really come together, we can thought partner, we can talk through some of these issues and figure out not only how do we support one another, but how do we support Cornell as an institution. And so if this is of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Would love to have a quick conversation and figure out how to get you more involved. So with that said, I think I will now turn it over to you, Professor Ortiz, for an introduction, and then we can go into Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christina and Richard, and everyone. Please call me Paul. I'm finishing my second semester at Cornell. My wife Sheila and I moved up from the University of Florida. I taught there for 16 years, and I directed the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and was an affiliated faculty member in the Center for Latin American Studies. Had a very good run at the University of Florida. We had a very strong faculty union there, affiliated with both the NEA and the AFT and the AFL-CIO, of course. And we actually had some victories. And we beat Governor DeSantis more than a few times. You know, very anti-labor governor. But the chance to come to ILR and Cornell was really like a dream come true for me, because I really came up through the ranks in the labor movement. I grew up in a shipyard town, Bremerton, Washington, working class community. No one really talked to us about going to college back then. All of our elders had been in the military. That's what I did too after high school. And but when I returned from Central America in the late 80s, I was in U.S. Special Forces, was involved in a lot of the civil wars in Central America in the mid-late 80s. But when I returned to the United States, I really wanted to get some answers. And the first answer was, what was the enormous disjuncture between what I was taught about the United States and what I experienced in Central America about the United States, and what people told me in the region about my country. And it seemed at some point they knew more about the United States than I did. And that really was my pathway to becoming a historian. And early on, when I returned to the US, someone had the presence of mind to put a book in my hand, which was a life changer. And that was a book written by another combat veteran by the name of Howard Zinn. And that book was People's History of the United States. And that was just like, wow. I mean, I still have my original copy. I have to glue it together and tape it together. It's just full of I read that book several times. But when I went to graduate school in the early 90s, I had been a participant. I worked with the United Farm Workers Union in the Chateau Saint Michel boycott, which was an 8-year struggle. And I always thank everyone when I'm giving a talk like this, because I'm sure some of you participated and boycotted the wines during that long struggle. And I'm just very thrilled to say the Chateau Saint Michel workers are celebrating this year 30 years of having union contracts from 1995 to present. And so I saw that solidarity works, and that really pushed me to go to grad school. I started Duke in 1993. The problem, though, was that when I was in grad school, that was not a good time for labor history, and there's a lot of downsizing. And even our faculty, like Leon Fink, a great labor historian, told us that labor history is probably finished. And so when I started my career as an academic in 2001, I still taught labor history. At UF, I would teach labor history every other year. But things have changed radically in the past 5 or 8 years. And Richard mentioned that your alumni group in ILR was organized in part around this idea of labor and social justice. And I can tell you that the interest in topics like Latino studies and labor history, especially, just skyrocketed about 5 or 8 years ago. And when I would open my labor history course at UF, for example, for registration, it would fill snap. I mean, within 5 minutes, the enrollment was filled. And they're very different from 10 or 15 years ago. So when ILR called and said, "Hey, do you want to come and teach labor history?" I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" I'm in the next flight. So it has been just a wonderful experience teaching labor history at ILR. I understand that folks are really interested in, and you'll be pleased to know that the students at ILR Latino Studies, I work with a lot of Latino Studies students too. They're just much more keyed into labor and social justice issues than I was when I was an undergraduate. I was interested in labor, but frankly, we took unions for granted where I grew up. And if you had asked me, how do you organize a union when I was a young worker, I would have had no idea what to tell you. This generation, or these generations that I'm working with now in ILR and Cornell, are very different. They have older brothers and sisters who perhaps are involved in the Starbucks union campaigns or Amazon, or the graduate students. Our graduate students at Cornell just negotiated their first union contract. It's a tremendous breakthrough and I don't have to tell you, a lot of Latino studies and a lot of ILR grad students were heavily involved in that campaign. Teaching Latino studies in higher ed has been just an incredible experience, because I've been able to bring a lot of my personal experience to the table. And one of the questions I saw was about Dolores Huerta, and working with John Leguizamo's film crew on American Historia was just a peak experience for me, because when the crew talked to historians, another is Ben DeJesus, who's just a top of the line filmmaker, and he asked us at a certain point, who are the people in Latino history who are still alive that we have to talk with? And Dolores was number one in everyone's list. Like, she is this astonishing, accomplished, heroic, courageous person, co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez, walks the talk, has used her career as a labor organizer to branch out, to be an ally for LGBT people, to be an ally for dissenters, for women, for civil rights. For me, watching the series, the most astonishing experience, and it's really an astonishing series, but to watch John Leguizamo walking arm in arm with Dolores Huerta brought tears to my eyes. Because for me and for my wife, Sheila, who I met in the farm worker movement, who we picketed together, we organized together, we got arrested together. And when we got arrested, we realized, after that experience, we're like, hey, we went to jail together. I guess we can get married. And we're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary next month. But Dolores was actually going to come to our marriage ceremony, and she got derailed because there was a big strike in Northern California someplace. So the strike had precedence, obviously, over our wedding ceremony. American Historia is a different kind of series, and it was really amazing to work on it. There have been a lot of very important Chicano history series that PBS has run in the past. I've used those for many years. There have been really good Puerto Rican documentaries. Gordon Parks was involved in one a number of years ago. Many of you probably know the name of Gordon Parks. He did a series, or he did a film documentary with PBS in 1969 called The World of Piri Thomas. And that was a landmark in documentary on Latino history, because the world, according to Piri Thomas, was really rooted in what we used to call Spanish Harlem or East Harlem. And Piri Thomas had just released this remarkable book called Down These Mean Streets, which was what life for him was like growing up as a Puerto Rican working class kid in Spanish Harlem during the Great Depression. So PBS had run these types of programs before. The vision, I think, that Ben De Jesus and other filmmakers had with John Leguizamo was, let's do something that is comprehensive as possible, and hence the term Latinx. And you'll see throughout the series that John uses that term. That's not a term that I grew up with. I'm just old enough to remember when Chicano was still kind of edgy. And when our fathers began using that term and our parents began using that term, we're like, okay, it's okay to use the term Chicano on the West Coast. I'm Mexican American. But there were a lot of elders who still didn't like that term, and preferred other terms. And I was asked by Richard and other folks to talk about a little bit about the evolution of terms used to describe us. Now, when I wrote an African American and Latinx history of the United States, the original title was an African American and Latina history of the United States. And a number of my students took me aside and they said, Professor Ortiz, if you want our generation, that is anyone from like around age 15 to 30, to read this book, we would prefer you use the term Latinx. Reason being, we prefer, and I have to respect this because I go all throughout the country giving talks, say this in South Chicago, Washington Heights, up in New York, Houston, Texas, 4th and 5th Ward, where my father's people grew up, East Los Angeles, Miami, et cetera, et cetera. So when I go and give these talks, I check out, what is the term or terms that people prefer in this local community. And I respect those terms. I have no ownership over those terms. And so each neighborhood, each part of the country has a specific request and a way they want to be identified. And I really connect with this because as a kid growing up in a federal shipyard town with a father who was retired military like a couple times over, and my dad was actually, he was the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for Hispanics at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, but he hated that term Hispanic. And he forbade us to use the term at home. And, as kids, we didn't know, well, why? He would say, that's the term the government wants us to use. I don't like that term. And even though he was working for the government his whole life. But fast forward it to when I was working on an African American Latinx history of the United States, my students said, this is a term, Latinx, that allows us to keep our own term. We're Puerto Rican, we're Dominican, we're Cubano, whatever the case may be. So using Latinx isn't forcing us to give up our kind of national origin terms, but it's an umbrella term. It allows us to talk about our peoples from the Americas like at one time, and to kind of weave people together from different continents, from the Caribbean, from South America, from Mexico, from New York City to Seattle. So they said, we really prefer Latinx. And you'll see throughout the series that John also, he uses different terms too, but then he also kind of comes back to Latinx. John's vision for the series was really to say, and he tasked the historians, and he said, we want to communicate to this general audience that watch PBS or whoever watches it, that our peoples have been in U.S. history every step of the way. And a big emphasis, and you can see especially in part 2, is in our wars, the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II. And so that was one emphasis. Another emphasis that the film crew really brought in was women have to be in the foreground. It cannot be the case that you start with talking about a lot of men and then you bring the women in, as almost like an afterthought. And so that was a big emphasis from the very beginning. And then the third emphasis was something that I think a few of us of the historians really pushed, and I insisted upon, was that Latinx history is a working class history, and there are some of us who have been lucky enough to become doctors, to go to universities, to be professionals, et cetera, et cetera. But even those of us who are lucky enough to have those experiences are just one or at the most two generations removed from working with our hands. We all had parents who worked in factories, who worked as farm workers, who worked in restaurants, who were bussers, who were elevator operators, bus drivers, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my big pitch, and I never really got any pushback from that. And so it was a delight as a Mexican American, trained in Latino history and labor history to kind of be able to live out my kind of scholarly values, my personal experiences, in the series. I was especially thrilled, though, and I have to get back to the military part, and this surprises some of my colleagues because I'm an activist in Veterans for Peace, and they're like, what is all this war stuff? And I said, I really agree with John on this point that in American history, if you are somehow absent from the entire narrative, especially the American Revolution and the Civil War, you're absent. And when I wrote an African American Latinx history of the United States, I wrote that book especially because my students would tell me, hey, why do Cubans only show up in 1959 in a U.S. history textbook? And why are Haitians absent? Why is Mexico a second-class citizen in U.S. history? And that's really why I wrote an African American Latinx history of the United States the way I wrote it, to say that those three nations, just right there, I mean, there should be others, but you can only write so much in 200 pages. I said Mexico, Haiti, and Cuba at least should be at the center of the story of U.S. history, again, from day one. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was picked to be part of the series. If you notice, the other scholars are all people who do what we call kind of intersectional history. That is, like I'm teaching this semester at ILR, we're just finishing, I'm teaching my African American and Latino histories class. It's a course I've taught for almost 25 years now. And I started when I was in grad school at Duke, and I would teach African American history in the fall and Latino history in the spring, or vice versa. And at a certain point, the students I had, and this gets back to what Richard was saying in the beginning, the students I had who were really into labor and social justice, the students who were pre-med at Duke who wanted to work in migrant farm worker communities, who wanted to do farm worker legal services, who were young, aspiring labor organizers, or they wanted to be teachers in urban communities in, say, South Chicago or El Paso. They were the ones who were kind of pushing me to create this new kind of intersectional African American and Latino histories curriculum. We didn't use the term, by the way, back then, intersectional. That comes a bit later. And that term, by the way, is like persona non grata, especially in Florida. You're not supposed to, Governor DeSantis and President Trump hate the term intersectional. And I think there's really important reasons why they hate it. We can get into those later. But I kind of brought those interests and experiences into the series. And so you can see, like, my background, really, I bring my personal experiences, I bring my teaching experiences, my scholarly experiences. When I first started teaching African American Latino histories, by the way, I had to dig deep for materials for that class, materials that talked about Black history different aspects of Latino history, but in an intersectional manner. There's very few of that, or very little of that when I first started back in 2000. Now I have to turn sources away because there's a richness. So the scholarship, the ethnic studies scholarship, the working class scholarship has really just blossomed, especially in the past 8 or 10 years. My last class, which was Monday, I brought back one of my former students, Gabriel Espinosa Ramos, and he is a very successful immigration attorney in San Francisco. You can look him up, and he goes toe to toe with the Homeland Security attorneys, and he works on, asylum cases for immigrant workers who are under distress, who've been abused, domestic abuse, or facing possible even assassination if they return to their home countries. And Gabriel took my class back in 2008, and he just gave an incredible talk to the ILR students on Monday, many of whom are green card holders, many of whom are in different statuses in terms of citizenship. And it was very powerful to have a former student who's an out gay Latino student from San Francisco really give courage and hope to our students at ILR. I wish I could have got him into American Historia, but I couldn't. You can only do so much. But just to kind of wrap up my talk, and then I really do want to leave it open for Q&A. The experience of working with John and the film crew was just astonishing because these were people who understood the stakes. And this was before the election, way before the election. We started working on this about 3 years ago. But even then, we realized that there were efforts to silence, to crush our histories. And when I say our histories, I mean, African American, Latino histories, working class histories. For obvious reasons, the people in power now don't want younger people or older people, for that matter, learning these stories. Why don't they want them learning these stories? When you listen to someone like Dolores Huerta, and John is sitting with her and telling her, and asking her, how did you get involved in this? And she talks about, she saw, her fellow students, some of them Black students, some of them darker skinned students who were terribly discriminated against as K through 12 students. And she said, I determined, I vowed to myself and made a promise that I was going to do something about these injustices. But it wasn't until later in life that I learned that to do something about these terrible injustices, I had to learn to organize. I had to work across class, across racial lines, across religious lines to get people together to challenge injustice. And right there is the clue as to why people in power don't want us learning these histories. They don't want us teaching these histories. As you know, there's an attack right now in many of our museums, the Smithsonian, which is why I think this series was just so timely. It was just such a great experience. We've had a lot of events around the series, a lot of watch parties, a lot of community groups, churches, synagogues. I talked at a mosque on a Zoom a few weeks ago, and they used American Historia as kind of a common viewing kind of experience. So it's just been a great experience. So I think I'll kind of pause for now and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have several prepared questions, but we'll do that with the group and we'll kind of alternate. So let me start. In some of your writing, you've described the rise of the United Farm Workers as the single most important event in Latino American history. Could you elaborate on that? Maybe say why you feel that.
Yeah, and the statement that I made, which I really believe, I was kind of retrained by Ben DeJesus and the other filmmakers who sat down with all the historians and they said, look, with all due respect, Professor Ortiz, this is not a lecture. We need you to be much faster. This is a fast-paced kind of narrative. We want to keep people's attention. When you make statements, please don't do your typical academic wind-up. and you're hemming and hawing and it's complicated. They didn't want the complicated statements, right? That's for the classroom. And so when it got to Dolores Huerta, saying that the Rise of the United Farm Workers was the single most important event in Latinx history, what I mean to convey by that, Richard, is that the UFW is what we call a borning movement. That is it's important in and of itself. It's the first sustained, successful farm worker union in the history of this country. Beyond that, though, and again, Dolores Huerta's life personifies this, Cesar Chavez's life, Philip Veracruz personifies this. It was critical because it brought so many people from different groups together who learned how to become organizers and then spun off and did incredible work for the rest of their lives. And what I mean by this is that if you look as late as the election of Barack Obama in 2008, you will find many organizers who by that point are in their 60s and older who had got their organizing chops with the United Farm Workers Union, either during the Great Boycott or the Lettuce Boycott, or even in my case, many years later with the United Farm Workers of Washington State with the Chateau Saint Michel wine boycott. So the rise of the United Farm Workers it's almost like it's almost like a social justice organizing workshop in many ways. Most of the organizers who work with the UFW were there for a year or two, and then kind of went on and did other things, but they always look back to that as a formative experience. And then finally, it was internationally critical because it really, in the mid 60s and late 60s, the labor movement was going through some hard times. And the United Farm Workers Great Boycott really re-energized a lot of labor unions. The United Auto Workers got involved. The Steelworkers Union gave a lot of support. And internationally, it really brought back the American labor movement in so many ways. So I could talk about this for hours. Well, I'll kind of stop there. I mean, the UFW has never been a huge union, but I think when in my African American Latino Histories class, we compare it to, say, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union in the early 20th century, an African American led union, also never a huge union, but important beyond its original scope. That is, it really awakens this social justice, this power. You think of Robert F. Kennedy, the real Robert F. Kennedy getting involved with Cesar Chavez, being involved in the fasts, during the Great Boycott, Jesse Jackson, so many other leaders, Leon Davis with 1199, the great labor union leader for 1199 in New York City, supported the Great Boycott. So it just brought a lot of people together who learned how to become organizers and also who learned how to work, again, I'll use the term intersectionally across different, lines of language, lines of culture. How is it that this embattled, primarily Mexican and Filipino union in California kind of sparked this incredible social justice renaissance? I mean, we're just really getting to understand that now.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I really don't want us to switch gears too much at all because I am enjoying this conversation, but I'm also looking at some of the prepared questions. But one of the things among the things that you've said that really resonates with me is this idea of really knowing your history. And when I was in ILR, I remember I took a class called, I want to say it was called Latinos in the US, more than likely some kind of variation of that. And I was able to kind of learn a lot more about our history here in the US. And a lot of the things I learned in that class, I did not learn in high school and middle school, things that I had never known before. And so with that in mind, one of the questions I want to ask here is, from your perspective, Paul, what challenges still exist for Hispanic students in higher education? And how can institutions like Cornell help overcome them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Christina. The big thing that John Leguizamo emphasized throughout this entire process of doing the documentary is, we're not outsiders. And we have been, involved in this country from the very beginning. Among Mexican Americans, we have this phrase, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." And my colleagues in anthropology and archaeology tell us that, people from not just Mexico, but points way further south had traveled to the Mississippi Valley, traveled as far north as the Klamath in Oregon, 2, 3, 4,000 years ago. In other words, people in this hemisphere have gone back and forth. This idea of borders, this idea of, we have to assimilate, is something that I grew up with, certainly. But what it did to us is it created a sense of second-classness, of, we're not good enough. We never saw anything like American Historia when I was growing up as a kid. And the term that was used in our communities, Christina, was assimilation. You need to learn how to adhere to the dominant culture. And I remember watching, as I was preparing for American Historia, actually the World War II segment, I saw this awful movie. I'm not even going to give you the title of it, but it basically talked about, it was a documentary, and it claimed that World War II was the first war that Latinos had fought in. And I got so angry. I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, most of the filmmakers of that film were probably dead, so it's no use. It's too late to talk with them. But this is why I think this type of work is so critical, and the work that ILR does. In terms of working class students, I talk to a lot of students, as you all know, if you're alumni. ILR has a high percentage of working class students. Some of them are from Buffalo, some of them are from the Lower East Side, New York City. Some of them, I have a couple of students from Spanish Harlem, my African-American Latino Histories class. And the thing they tell me over and over again is, we don't see, in high school and even in other parts of Cornell, we don't see our parents in the history books. We don't see our ancestors in the history books. And it gives us a sense of otherness, of being an outsider. And that was the thing with American Historia that we tried to address head on. We all belong here. None of us are that new. We all have unique stories. And certainly that was what I was trying to do with an African American and Latino histories class. I had Haitian students who were so astonished at the role that the Haitian Revolution had played in slavery abolition in this country. They had never heard that before. I had first generation Mexican students I worked with at Santa Cruz who said, we were never taught, and these were kids who went to really good schools in Mexico even. They said, we were never taught that we abolished slavery before the United States. We were never taught that Mexico was a primary sanctuary for escaped former enslaved African Americans. And some of them would come to my class, Christina, literally in tears, or my office hours in tears. They would say, why weren't we told these histories in middle school or high school or even in college? Working class students, the same experience. Why weren't we told that about like the CIO in the 1930s, industrial unionism? Why weren't we told about these great, the 1199 in New York City? I have a couple students whose grandparents were organizers in 1199. And they said that until they took ILR classes, they didn't realize what a big deal their grandparents were. They're like, wow, our grandparents were amazing social justice pioneers. So yeah, again, this is something I could just go on and on about, but the personal connection that I have to history is I just talk to and I do a lot of work with public school districts. And my fear, Christina, is that we're beginning to go backwards, because when you have people in federal government literally whitewashing history. I was just in Mississippi just a couple weeks ago at the Walter Anderson Museum. Mississippi has lost their budget for humanities. Public humanities has been zeroed out. It's horrific. And Florida is the same way. And so yeah, it's a time where history is more important than ever. And again, you can understand why people in power would not want us to know, one, our people's histories, but also equally important, how our histories intersect, how they come together. Again, think about the narrative that John is weaving during the American Revolution. How many of us, let's be honest, and I'll be the first to raise my hand, how many of us didn't know that Spain played an incredibly important role in the American Revolution? And without Spanish support, especially down south in the Gulf of Mexico, dare we say, there were some critical battles that Hispanic sailors fought against the Brits. The taking of Fort George, by the way, is one of the astonishing feats in naval history. It's still argument. The British had these incredible cannons. The Spanish found a way to defeat Fort George. How was that? I mean, if any one of those cannons had been active and fired one ball at any of those ships, it would have sunk them. And yet they were able to win that battle. But I didn't learn about that growing up. I mean, I learned about George Washington, but I certainly didn't learn about any Hispanic sailors in the American Revolution. So anyway, yeah.
Well, Paul, I'm just going to follow up the point you and Christina made. It reminded me, was kind of a labor history person at ILR. One of my unions that, gave me the opportunity to teach labor history to their members. And one time I was telling, and I went through the Great Rail Strike of 1877 and Homestead and Pullman and Ludlow Massacre and Triangle. And I went through all of this stuff. And finally somebody blurted out and said, "Why don't I know any of this? I went to school. Why don't I know any of this?" And I said, "It's because they don't want you to know."
Yeah.
So with that in mind, how do you compare the experiences of Latino workers with those of Black workers with respect to, unionizing in the U.S.? Sometimes Black workers were excluded from some unions, especially in the South. Sometimes they were used as strike breakers, against unions. On the other hand, often they stood in solidarity with the white workers. So how are the experiences of Latino and Black workers in those regards similar or different?
Yeah, Richard. Well, I think that segment 2 of American Historia, which is probably my favorite of the segments, it has the sequence on traqueros, or Mexicans who worked on building the railways. And that experience is something that really brings together a lot of African Americans worked on the rails. Their experiences were primarily in the Southeast in building a rail system. Even enslaved African Americans built that initial rail system in the Southeast before the American Civil War. The experiences, it's interesting because oftentimes African American and Latino workers are doing the same types of work, sometimes though in different eras, oftentimes in different regions. And that's certainly the case with agricultural labor. Like when I started getting involved in the farm worker movement, there were crops, there were entire migrant, streams, as they used to call them, that had been primarily African American or perhaps Caribbean, that were becoming Central American or Mexican American by the 1980s, 1990s. So a lot of the same work experiences, but different eras. And so certainly a lot of food for thought. In terms of organizing, what sticks out is the incredible role that women labor organizers play in each of these communities. When you're talking about Latino workers, for example, we talked about Dolores Huerta quite a bit, but there's these amazing women leaders in the 1930s, Emma Tenayuca, Luisa Moreno. We were able to get a few of them into the series. We could have gotten 3 or 4 times as many. The role that women play as leaders in their respective communities in Black and Mexican and Latino communities that carries over into the leadership of labor organizing is quite marked. It's really, I've had some former students who have done dissertations working specifically on the role that women play in both Black and brown labor organizing. So those are joining experiences. The final thing that ties them together is the issue of citizenship. because if you think about African American workers, for much of the experience of African Americans in this country, they have been treated by the country as outsiders, even though most of their were there here long before most Europeans were. Their citizenship as workers has been taken from them in many cases. They had to fight for that citizenship on more than one occasion. Certainly in the American Revolution, a lot of African Americans fought in the Continental Army. They had to fight for the right to vote. They lost that vote, many of them in New York and Pennsylvania in the 1830s. They regained the right to vote in the American Civil War with the 14th and 15th Amendment, and then they lose it again and have to fight for the right to vote back in the 1960s. Latino workers have a very similar trajectory in the sense that our experiences as workers, we take, what's that phrase, one step forward and two steps back. I guess what I'm trying to say, Richard, is that our citizenship and its connection to our rights in the workplace are intimately connected, and they're very contested constantly. It seems like our citizenship is always kind of conditional. And even now, I just finished a piece for the Labor Studies Journal where I was talking about the role that Latino workers have played in this resistance against the worst aspects of the Trump anti-immigrant. And what's striking about this is that the great majority of people in the Latino working class now, in many parts of the country, are undocumented or they're not full citizens. And I think the case can be made that there is a connection to African American working class history where both groups of workers, and we have to be careful because, again, there's regional differences, there's differences in the laws, et cetera, over time. But again, our citizenship has always been very contested, very fragile, and subjected to the fact that we've had to struggle over and over again to just keep what we've earned or what our ancestors or parents earned in the last generation.
Thanks, Paul. Christina and I both have lists of more questions, but if anybody in the group wants to pose a question, maybe raise your hand or put it in the chat and one of us will ask it. Maybe Christina, why don't you go with one of yours and then somebody puts it in, we'll ask that.
Yeah. Anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand as well, and I'll make sure to mute myself and let you ask. But while we wait, another question from me, Paul. We all have a story to tell, and we're all interested and passionate about certain topics for a reason. And so I guess one of my questions to you is, as somebody who's obviously studied this work for quite some time, who has written about these topics extensively over the years, what personal experiences really shaped your perspectives and kind of landed you where you are now? What do you have any kind of examples or any stories that really helped kind of anchor your interest in a lot of this work?
Thank you, Christina. I think my experiences as a younger labor organizer, with the United Farm Workers of Washington State, during the Chateau Saint Michel wine boycott, we were given zero chance of winning that boycott. We were up against U.S. Tobacco, which was one of the most powerful companies in the world. And a lot of our friends, even, some in the Democratic Party said, you could take on anyone. Why did you have to take on U.S. Tobacco? U.S. Tobacco owned the Chateau Saint Michel vineyards at that point. They had a very successful series of wineries. They'd have concerts every summer. People like Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, Willie Nelson would come and perform at the Chateau Saint Michel vineyard. So the U.S. Tobacco used Chateau Saint Michel as kind of a PR veneer, if you will, to try to get people to forget the fact that their main product was cigarettes and tobacco. And seeing the courage and resilience of primarily, undocumented Mexican and Central American farm workers. I'm a third generation, quote unquote immigrant. My people came here from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution in 1914. And so there's a connection, but our experiences were very different than people who came from Mexico, in the 1980s, and that was predominantly the Chateau Saint Michel vineyard workforce. And just seeing a lot of racism against those farm workers. Chateau Saint Michel had a union, but it was the Teamsters Union, and it was almost all white workers. It was just, the racism was just so obvious. It was unfortunately too easy. Because Chateau Saint Michel would say, well, we don't think that the vineyard workers are ready for unions. Well, but your drivers are. What's the difference between them? Oh, does race have something to do with it? And so that struggle, and then finally seeing the workers win the struggle, and then seeing some people like Edward James almost threw down with us early on, and he allowed us to make a poster, and everyone loves Eduardo almost, my God. And Willie Nelson one year, he was invited to give a big concert at Saint Michel, and he turned them down. He said, I'm not going to cross the picket line. That was a powerful experience. And Christine, I remember the last experience I remember for that was, we went from a situation where people said, this Mexican American Latinos cannot win this struggle. And halfway through the boycott, I remember my wife and Sheila and I were walking down the hallway of the Washington State Legislature in Olympia, Washington, to give testimony for a collective bargaining bill that would cover agricultural workers. And we just happened to run into the head PR guy for U.S. Tobacco. I don't know, because he was giving testimony on something else, right? And we walked, and we recognized each other. We're walking down, opposite ends of the hallway, and he looks at us, and he stops, and he just, like, he's taken, and he kind of flings his arms back. He says, "Look, leave me alone. I tell all the restaurants and stores, if you're approached by those people on the boycott, you better just take those wines off the shelf right now, because those people don't quit." And he was just trying to say, "Hey, leave me alone. Don't attack me in the halls of the Washington State Legislature." And so this experience of seeing people power, at the grassroots, supposedly, uneducated, working class people, like, hold the line and win these struggles. And Christina, to know 30 years later that, the Chateau Saint Michel vineyard workers didn't get rich, with the union contract, but they've been able to use that to buy houses, to send their kids to college, to live a decent life that is not open to people who don't have those protections. And they fought for them and won. So to me, that will all through the rest of my life, I always go back to that experience. And I think that allows me to connect to students today who are trying to figure out, how do we, deal with this chaos, as my former student, Gabriel Espinosa, calls it, a constitutional crisis, when he came and gave the guest lecture on Monday. And I was so glad he said it, because my students, like, I can say it, but when mid-30 something, charismatic Latino lawyer says it, it really meant something. But yeah, I just,
Well, heading questions from the field, let me ask you, sort of related. You've written about the importance of the Culinary Workers Union in Las Vegas in elections, and can you describe what you think makes that union special and how it relates to its Latino members?
Yeah. The Culinary Workers Union, Richard, when I was an organizer with the United Farmers of Washington State, we started learning about the Frontier Hotel strike in Las Vegas. And this was another kind of, almost, it looked like a hard luck struggle, because the Culinary Workers Union, it was an all-women strike. It was about 600 women that went on strike and walked out of the Frontier Hotel, owned by a multi-billionaire. And no one gave them a chance in hell, excuse my language, to win that struggle. They were on strike for 6 years. Not a single woman crossed the picket line. And they would send out these kind of flying squadrons to educate people in the West Coast and the East Coast. And we would intersect with them because I would be out on speaking things too. And I just relished the opportunity to be with someone from the Culinary Workers Union. And I thought, oh my gosh, these women are hope to die trade unionists. Remember that phrase? Just tough as nails. And they won the strike. And the union grew from being, it had been a mobbed up union, let's be honest, in Las Vegas. The former leaders have been connected to the mob. And the women that came to that union, mainly African-American migrant workers from Alabama, Latina migrant workers from the Philippines, from Asia, from Mexico, transformed that union in the 1990s. And they have over 60,000 members now. And I do this experiment with my Cornell students. I say, at Cornell, we value diversity. We value speaking, hearing, and learning different languages. And the Cornell website has a website where they say that at Cornell, we're proud that our students come from 80 different nations or something like that. And I asked the students when we get to the culinary workers, well, how many different nations do you think the culinary workers come from? And it turns out that the Culinary Workers Union represents workers from 150 different nations. And when they have their union meetings, you can just imagine in terms of the translation. And in my book, An African American Latino History of the United States, which, by the way, Beacon is just now said we're going into, they're going to make a young adult version of the book. And I'm so thrilled about that. But that union was pivotal to the presidency of Barack Obama. And what I mean by this is that when Barack Obama was running as a senator during the Democratic primary and no one had heard his name, the culinary workers had a strike, and he went and he walked in the picket line and he talked to a number of the women on the picket line. And remember, this is a women-led union. This is not your father or grandfather's union movement. These are militant, courageous women. And they said, if this senator was going to walk the picket line with us, we're going to support him. And when the Culinary Workers Union decided to support Senator Obama in the primaries in 2008, it changed the whole trajectory of the primaries. And suddenly the big West Coast union federations, the LA Federation, which represents 1.5 million members, the San Francisco Bay Area represents 580,000 workers. The Seattle-Tacoma Fed, which represents probably 300,000 or 400,000 workers. After the Culinary Workers Union endorsed Senator Obama, it was like watching dominoes fall. And the culinary workers didn't just endorse him. They said, we're going to walk for you. We're going to canvass. We're going to call. And I remember, Richard, the image that comes to mind of that 2008 election was, at one point, one of the officers of the Culinary Workers Union, a woman who had been a refugee from El Salvador, I believe, she was being interviewed on the television, and the person interviewing her was very arrogant. He said, why would you think that one union could have an impact in this election? You only have 60,000 members. And she looked at him with a sparkle in her eye, and she said, yeah, but we Hispanics have big families. And using a racial stereotype and turning it on its head and saying, we're going to all of our families. It isn't just the 60,000 people who are canvassing. It's all of our family members who are involved in this canvass for this young African-American senator. And the rest, as they say, is history. I think the culinary workers, and I've done some educational work with them, and they use part of the book in African-American Latinx history of the U.S., in their education programs. I just think that they're a union of the future in many ways. And I see my former students move into union positions, especially younger women, and they're really transforming the face of the labor movement.
Thanks. That's great. Christina, you want to go?
I was just going to say, yeah, are we at time? This ends at 8, right? Eastern?
Theoretically, but if people want to go, we can keep going a little.
I
Yeah.
Is that okay? I want to be
Yep.
mindful in case anyone needs to drop, not to feel weird about dropping if you must, understanding, that it is later on the East Coast. So in case you do need to log off, please feel free, but we will keep the conversation going. Maybe do one more question and then we can go into closing.
Sure.
Awesome. So with all that said, in terms of our next questions, and I think this is a really good closing question, is what trends or opportunities give you hope for the future for the Hispanic community in the US?
Well, I see that people, your alumni associations give me hope, number one, because you have a commitment to the long-term health and well-being of students. That is, you've had these successful careers and you're coming back, you're staying connected to our students, to the faculty, to the staff. We need that more than ever. What gives me hope is to see that there are more younger folks. I don't want to be ageist, but I'm getting older myself, so I'm looking at this carefully. There are a lot of younger folks who are learning these skills of organizing much sooner in their lives than my generation perhaps did. A lot of our students have been connected. We talk a lot about the Starbucks campaigns, union organizing. We talk about Amazon. We mentioned at the top of our discussion about the grad students union at Cornell. That gives me such great hope because these are the future professors. And one experience, actually, I have two graduate teaching assistants in my African American and Latino histories class because it has 120 students. And after they finished their successful negotiations, I had both of the students give a presentation about, well, how did the grad students at Cornell unionize? How did you come together? What were your key issues? And I was just so thrilled that they gave this great presentation about, we're unionizing, not just because we need to make a living wage in a very expensive town, but we're doing it for our students. We're doing it because we want to be better instructors. We want to be at a level where we're not constantly stressed out and we can focus on the classroom or on the lab or on the field work or whatever we do. And it was very inspiring. But the part of it, Christina, that I really wanted my undergraduates in ILR to hear was how the grad students got the contract. Because when I left to go on a speaking tour, Cornell had just announced, in its infinite wisdom, that it would never give up on the issues of just cause and the union shop. It said it wanted the grad students at Cornell to have an open shop and to not have a just cause protection. Now, I'm not going to go into details, but having a union contract without just cause is like, why even bother? And when I got back from the speaking tour, suddenly Cornell announced it had agreed to just cause and union shop. Well, how did that happen? The grad students got together and they made a commitment to each other. And they said, we've got to show Cornell that we are serious. And so they were able to get over 1,000 Cornell grad students to sign a pledge saying that if we do not get just cause for each other, and if we don't get a union shop, we'll go on strike. Now, they didn't want to go on strike, and I can tell you the faculty didn't want to go on strike. But at some point in your life, if something is important enough to fight for, and these are the things that Dolores Huerta has taught us all these years, you have to be willing to make a sacrifice. And so the 1,000 students getting together and signing the strike pledge was the thing that caused Cornell to realize, hey, we may have underestimated the grad students at the beginning, but we're not underestimating them now. They are serious. So that gives me great hope that people are organizing in a very sophisticated way. And we're seeing more examples of solidarity, of people sticking up for each other. And Christina, that's the most important thing. We can have all the ideology, we can have the facts on our side, but if we don't learn how to support each other, we are lost. The thing that gives me hope is to see people learning these lessons of community and labor organizing, and taking these values forward in life. The last thing I'll say about this is that among ILR faculty, a lot of us would hope that our students, go into labor organizing or, union education or, women's, rights organizing. The reality is that they're thinking about putting bread on the table, just like we were. They've got to make a living. And it may be possible for them to go into labor as organizing or reproductive rights as a field, but in many cases, they just can't do that, especially in their early 20s. But if we can get them, and that's why bringing Gabriel Espinosa to my class on Monday was critical, and he picked up on this too. He said, I want you to know that you can become a professional and still embrace and live out social justice values and working class and labor values in any job you do, whether it's being an attorney, a doctor, a teacher, a business person. And that also gives me hope as well. The fact that, yeah, not all of our students, even in ILR, are going into labor, but the fact that they're going to take this idea that working class people deserve dignity and respect, and everyone should be treated equally as a human being. Is it going to happen in our lifetime? Probably not. Is it something we should be working together on? Yes. And again, the thing about solidarity is so very important. I wish that we were able to get some of our friends and other social movements that should go unnamed to realize that we can have all the facts on our side. We can be as smart as we think we are, but unless we learn how to canvas, how to talk to people who may not even agree with us, who may look very different from us, who may speak a different language, unless we learn how to communicate better, we're lost. So the fact that we're doing those things better, I didn't talk about social media, but the fact that we are doing those things better now gives me some hope. But I do have to say, we're in a constitutional crisis. That's something we cannot underestimate. That's why, again, the fact you have these alumni organizations, I don't want to put all this on your backs, but the fact that we're organizing together is so critical, because if we don't, we are lost as a school, as a people, as a country. We could lose the republic. That's the place we're at now. And so these lessons of organization are more important than ever.
Well, I think that's a really good way to end, both on the positive and on the caution. I agree with all of that. For those in the ILR alumni, again, the Labor Rights Social Justice Group, we're trying to do things like this and do more of it, but also to be sort of a voice for labor and social justice movements and support faculty and support teaching labor at the ILR school. So, if you're an ILR, please get involved and engage. And thanks to CLAA for co-sponsoring us with this. I think that was great. And Paul, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge.